I'm Claire Harrington, 32, and in this house, I was taught to be grateful and silent. At the Harrington home, praise has a seating chart. Maggie sparkles, John inherits by default, Mother smiles for photographs, and Father measures love by quarterly reports. My part is to pass the dishes, fix the messes, and stand outside the frame. 6 years ago in a glass boardroom, the gavel came down, cut off, and I chose the rain outside over the silence inside, not to kneel, but to learn how to stand in my own name. Ever been told to know your place? Hit like if your boundaries were ever called ingratitude, and comment if you've had to start again from zero. And tonight, it all returns at the Thanksgiving table, a room that prefers spectacle to gratitude. The thought curled around me like a secret flame as the chauffeur opened the door to the Harrington estate. From the outside, nothing had changed. The wrought iron gates gleaming with fresh polish, the lanterns glowing with calculated warmth, the manicured lawn stretched wide, as if they too wanted to mock me for leaving years ago. Yet stepping onto the gravel drive, I felt the echo of Richard Sr.'s voice, the way one feels the chill in old bones. You'll regret walking away. He had spat those words at me the day I slammed the oak door behind me, younger and far more naive, believing freedom was its own kind of wealth. Inside, the dining hall shone with cruel brilliance. Crystal chandeliers hovered like frozen fireworks above the long mahogany table set for Thanksgiving 2023. Every fork and knife gleamed with the family crest, as though each piece of cutlery wanted to remind me whose bloodline had paid for it. The smell of roasted turkey and buttered squash drifted around me, but it only made the air heavier. I wore my grandmother's necklace, the only thing of true value she left me, though Eleanor once scoffed that it was sentimental junk. The navy dress I had chosen was modest, unembellished, the sort of thing no magazine would ever feature on a socialite. Yet it grounded me. I wasn't here to dazzle them. I was here to endure their eyes, to let them underestimate me, to sharpen the silence before striking. Richard Sr. sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, a glass of Bordeaux untouched in front of him. His stare was as cutting as I remembered, cold steel behind his rimless glasses. Eleanor floated beside him, pearls draped on her throat as though she was auditioning for a portrait. Maggie leaned forward, her lips glossed in a crimson shade that matched the cruel curve of her smile. John, already loosening his tie, pretended to sneeze into a napkin before tossing me a look of boredom. And in the shadows, as dependable as the ticking grandfather clock, Mr. Collins lingered by the doorway, observing, absorbing. He gave me the faintest nod in acknowledgement that did not belong to servants or masters, but to witnesses. Maggie was the first to strike. She looked at my dress and tilted her head as if analyzing a bargain bin find. Navy? How quaint. Did you run out of sequins in that little townhouse of yours? The others chuckled softly, a chorus rehearsed too well. John added his piece, blowing his nose with unnecessary drama. Careful not to bring any of that city dust into the soup, Claire. We wouldn't want the help to catch something from your neighborhood. His arrogance dripped like grease down a cheap spoon. Eleanor, queen of poisoned sugar, reached across the table as if to touch my hand but stopped short, her pearls trembling with each carefully enunciated word. We're just so glad you could make it, darling. It must have been such a sacrifice to come all this way. Travel costs can be rather unkind, I've heard. Their laughter rippled again, soft, cruel waves that only I seemed to drown beneath. I breathed in through my teeth, counting the seconds. I had promised myself not to lash out too early. Let them build the mountain of scorn higher, so that when it fell, the crash would be thunderous. I glanced at the silver cutlery. Each knife reflected my face in distorted lines, as if mocking me with a dozen fractured versions of who I once was. The girl who walked away empty-handed, the sister who abandoned her place, the daughter who would never be forgiven. Then came Maggie's smirk, bright and merciless, slicing through the moment. She leaned back in her chair, lifting her glass of champagne. "Tell us, Claire," she said loudly enough for Collins to pause in his step. "Did you at least bring enough for the cab ride home?" The table erupted again, Eleanor's laugh sharp, John's bark echoing against the chandeliered ceiling. I stared at them, my pulse steadying, my lips curving. I smiled calmly. Let's see who really can't afford the ride. The night I left Harrington Capital, they thought they buried me. Instead, they planted me. Maggie's barb about the cab ride had already curdled into silence on my lips, but the echo of her voice pressed against an older wound. The rain against the windows tonight reminded me of another storm, one that had raged 6 years earlier, the storm that had sealed my exile. The boardroom of Harrington Capital was a cathedral of glass and steel, perched above Charleston like a fortress for the privileged. That night, the storm raged outside, lightning clawing at the skyscrapers, thunder rolling like cannon fire. The conference table stretched longer than some of the apartments I'd rented since, polished wood reflecting every tense face, every drop of disdain. I had stood there younger, trembling but fierce, clutching a folder of projections I had built with sleepless determination. An idea that could have shifted their empire away from stale portfolios into emerging tech. I had believed in it like scripture. But Richard Sr. didn't see vision. He saw betrayal in anything that wasn't stamped with his authority. Ridiculous, he spat, his fist slamming the table so hard the water glasses trembled. You think you know better than the firm that made you? You dare to parade this fantasy in front of my board? His voice filled every corner of the room, drowning the storm itself. Maggie, lounging in her seat, let her laughter slip like perfume, sweet and poisonous. Honestly, Claire, I can't tell if you're bold or just desperate. Either way, it's entertaining. John leaned back, smirking, tapping his pen against the leather chair as if he were already signing my dismissal. She always thought she was different. Guess tonight we'll see how different she can be without a roof over her head. I pressed on. My voice cracked once, but I steadied it. This is the future. You can't keep clinging to fossilized investments and expect relevance. We need to pivot. Richard Sr. cut me off with the sharp crack of the gavel that lived on his desk, more symbol than tool. But tonight it was both. He brought it down with a fury that silenced even the thunder. You're cut off, he said, every syllable carved in ice. Harrington blood means nothing without Harrington Capital. You will have no allowance, no trust fund, no family account. You walk out those doors tonight, you walk into nothing. The words crashed harder than the storm outside. He was not simply rejecting an idea, he was severing me from every tie that had bound me to this house, this name, this lineage. For a heartbeat, I faltered. My eyes flicked to Maggie, who leaned forward, her lips brushing the rim of her glass as she whispered across the table, soft enough for only me to hear. Without us, you're nothing. The humiliation seared hotter than the rain, soaked night air waiting beyond the doors. I remember gathering my folder, knowing it was useless, a relic of a dream strangled before it could breathe. My heels echoed against the marble as I walked the length of that boardroom, every step peeling me further from the only life I had known. The lobby was cold and cavernous, the storm pressing its fingers against the glass panes. I stepped outside without an umbrella, rain drenching me instantly, plastering my hair to my face. The security guard at the door didn't meet my eyes, trained to ignore fallen royalty. Each drop felt like baptism, washing away Harrington gold, leaving only grit. I had nothing. No money, no allies, no plan. Only the rage of a daughter exiled in the iron of her own will. As the rain slashed across my skin, I promised myself that the night they thought they buried me was the night I began to grow roots deeper than their empire could ever touch. The dining hall snapped back into focus. The storm outside the estate windows tonight was gentler, a drizzle tapping faintly against the glass. My hand trembled only slightly as I reached for the water before me. I lifted the glass, crystal cold between my fingers, and whispered so low only I could hear. And yet, here I am. Thanksgiving dinner wasn't about gratitude. It was about showing off. The chandeliers above the Harrington dining table bathed everything in a theatrical glow, candlelight bouncing off cut glass, gilded rims, polished silver. The table itself gleamed like a stage set, not for communion, but for competition. Each relative played their role with precision, as though their worth was measured not in character but in how loudly their wealth could echo. John leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of burgundy wine with the arrogance of a man convinced he owned not just the glass but the vineyard, the land, the weather that birthed the grapes. Closed the deal just last month, he said, his voice dripping with casual pride. 80 million. Prime tower in Miami. Penthouse suites are already sold out cash offers, no contingencies. That's how you play the game. He punctuated the boast with a smirk at me, as if my silence were applause. Maggie chimed in with her trademark sweetness turned venom. She raised her hand to adjust her hair, making sure the diamond bracelet glittered against the candlelight. Oh, John, don't be so modest. 80 million is impressive, but honestly, my villa in Napa practically pays for itself during harvest season. You wouldn't believe the wine tasting parties. Everyone who's anyone flies out. I had to turn people away last year. Her laugh was light, the sort that invited agreement, demanded envy. The words slithered across the table like serpents. I sipped water, my grandmother's necklace cool against my collarbone, and let the parade march on. The more they spoke, the more they revealed not power, but hunger. Hunger to be admired, to be feared, to be untouchable. Eleanor, perfectly perched with her pearls gleaming, tilted her head toward me. Her tone was honeyed, but her smile cut like glass. Claire, dear, remind me, what do you call your little firm again? She made the word little sound like a disease. Her eyes sparkled with manufactured innocence, though the corners of her mouth betrayed the satisfaction of the jab. I met her gaze, unflinching, but I didn't answer. Silence was sharper than any retort. The absence of defense became their sport. Maggie leaned into John's shoulder, giggling. John tapped his glass against the table as though keeping time with my humiliation. Even Richard Sr., who had remained stoic and detached, eyes buried in the glow of his phone, allowed the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was not approval, it was amusement. The laughter began as a ripple, then grew into a wave. Maggie threw her head back, John slapped the table, Eleanor chuckled with the grace of a woman who never needed to pay her own bills. Their mirth bounced off the walls, ricocheting around the opulent room until it pressed against me from every side. I let it wash over me. I let them think the silence meant defeat. In truth, silence was the strongest weapon in a room that thrived on noise. When the laughter finally ebbed, I lowered my gaze deliberately, as if I had accepted the ridicule. Slowly, carefully, I placed my leather clutch on the gleaming surface of the table. The faint thud echoed louder than their boasts. Across the room, Mr. Collins, silent observer as always, stiffened. His eyes darted to the clutch, then to me, as though he sensed the weight it carried was far more than leather and stitching. He knew something was about to shift. And for the first time that night, the room no longer felt like theirs. It felt like mine. They mistook humiliation for dessert. The laughter from moments earlier still lingered like smoke, clinging to the ornate moldings of the dining room. But the tone had shifted quieter now, more pointed, sharpened into a dagger meant for me. The servants moved silently, refilling glasses, collecting plates, as if they too felt the chill that had settled in the air. Crystal glinted beneath the candlelight, and each chime of silverware striking porcelain rang like a gavel. John leaned back in his chair, one arm thrown carelessly over the backrest as though he were master of ceremonies. He snapped his fingers, not at the waiter but at the world itself. "Bring the 2009 Bordeaux," he announced, his grin cutting toward me. 10,000 a bottle, but for family, what's extravagance? Besides, he raised his glass in mock toast, we wouldn't want anyone here drinking something as common as water. Maggie let out a peal of laughter, then tilted her head toward me, her voice drenched in syrup that couldn't mask the venom. "Oh, darling, perhaps Claire can wash dishes to pay her share. I'm sure the staff could use an extra pair of hands." Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she flicked her wrist, like a whip lashing across the table. Richard Sr. finally stirred, his presence pressing like a weight over the room. His voice was low, measured, but each syllable was a command. "Don't embarrass us tonight." He didn't look at me when he spoke. His gaze remained fixed on the rim of his glass, as though I were an afterthought not worth the courtesy of eye contact. The waiter approached discreetly, his expression neutral yet uneasy, carrying a tray with a folded bill upon it. He lingered at John's side, as if waiting for the unspoken signal. John seized it eagerly, unfolding the slip of paper with a flourish. He raised his brows at the figure printed there, then allowed a slow, deliberate smirk to spread across his face. "Well," he said, sliding the bill across the table, his finger tapping it twice before pushing it in my direction. "It seems fitting that our dear, independent Claire takes care of this. A chance to prove that self-reliance isn't just a fairy tale." His words landed like poisoned darts, each syllable meant to pierce. Maggie leaned closer to watch. Eleanor's lips curled in the faintest shadow of a smile. Richard Sr. remained stone, and Collins shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing, the faintest flicker of curiosity crossing his otherwise unreadable face. For a heartbeat, silence claimed the room. The kind of silence that crackles with anticipation, the kind that demands a spectacle. They expected me to squirm, to protest, to reach for excuses. They expected the humiliation to seal my place beneath them once and for all. Instead, I reached into my clutch. Slowly, deliberately, I withdrew a sleek black card, its surface catching the light with quiet authority. Without a word, I set it on the tray before the waiter, my hand steady, my gaze calm. The card sat there like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through the room were immediate, though unspoken. The weight of silence is heavier than gold. It pressed down on the dining hall with such force that even the chandeliers seemed to dim, their glow caught in a breathless pause. The waiter, his hands steady from years of service, suddenly found his palms slick with sweat as he stared at the card on his tray. He inclined his head with unusual reverence, his voice carrying through the air like a judge delivering a verdict. "Of course, Miss Harrington. Owner's account." The words struck the table like thunder. Maggie's fork clattered from her manicured fingers, hitting the porcelain plate with a sharp metallic clang. She froze, lips parted, her perfect composure fractured into disbelief. John jerked back, nearly toppling his wineglass, fumbling with his spectacles as though clearer lenses could change what he had just heard. Eleanor's painted face lost its color in an instant, as if the foundations of her elegance were crumbling into dust. And Richard Sr., the patriarch whose cold indifference had been unshakable, finally lifted his gaze. His steel-gray eyes met mine across the long expanse of polished mahogany, and for the first time in years, I saw something flicker behind them. Not disdain, not amusement, but recognition. The silence deepened, drawn out by their shock, before I let it break with words as deliberate as the card I had placed down. "Relax," I said, my voice steady, even gentle. "This house belongs to me now." The air itself seemed to splinter. Maggie made a strangled noise, as though choking on disbelief. John leaned forward, his knuckles white around his glass. Eleanor's fingers trembled against her pearls, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The waiter bowed slightly, stepping aside, but another figure moved forward, Collins. Always watchful, always present at the edges of family gatherings, his calm mask had never betrayed a thought. Now, however, he cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of legal certainty. "It is true," he said, each word measured. "The estate was sold 6 months ago. The new deed lists Claire Harrington as the sole owner." The blow landed heavier than any insult ever thrown at me. Maggie dropped her napkin, shaking her head in denial. John's bravado crumbled as his mouth tightened into a grim line. Eleanor turned her face away, unwilling to be seen unraveling. Richard Sr. leaned back, exhaling slowly, as though recalculating the entire board of the game he thought he controlled. I let the silence return once more, not to wound but to give them space to feel the collapse of their illusions. Then I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands with ease. My eyes swept the table, lingering just long enough on each face to remind them that their mockery was now dust. And that's only the beginning. For the first time all night they stopped laughing. The dining room, once a stage for their smug performances, had gone strangely still. The flames of the candelabras flickered in the draught, shadows bending across the long mahogany table, etching unease into every polished surface. Silver cutlery lay abandoned, wine glasses untouched. The echo of the waiter's words, "owner's account," still trembled in the air like a verdict none of them could escape. Maggie was the first to crack. Her voice, usually sharp with rehearsed elegance, broke into a stammer. "You can't possibly, this is our estate. Ours. You've twisted something, some trick." Her jeweled hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening beneath rings meant to symbolize permanence. John leaned forward, his arrogance scrambling for footing. "She's bluffing," he snapped. "Or worse, renting. Some shell company fronting for her. No way you had the capital. No way you even had the wit. Who'd loan you a dime, Claire?" he sneered. But it lacked the old force, his words clattering hollow against the growing silence. Across the table, Eleanor pressed a trembling napkin to her lips. Her eyes darted between Richard Sr. and me, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would restore the order she clung to. Yet Richard Sr. sat unnervingly still, his narrowed eyes drilling into me with a cold, assessing precision. He did not deny. He did not question. He calculated. Collins, who had hovered at the edge like an unremarkable shadow, finally stepped into the candlelight. He adjusted his cufflinks with his usual quiet grace before speaking in a voice that cut sharper than any blade. "It is no trick," he said evenly. "Harrington estate was transferred through Low Country Equity 6 months prior. Legal, binding, and final." Maggie's sputter died mid-breath, her eyes wide as if Collins himself had betrayed her. John shook his head violently, muttering under his breath a desperate mantra. Impossible! Impossible! Eleanor leaned back, her pearls rattling softly against the wood of her chair, her face pale as wax. Richard Sr. tilted his head, the candlelight catching the deep lines etched across his face. He folded his hands, his voice low and deliberate. So, while they flaunted, you moved. You think this makes you powerful? I leaned back in my chair, calm, unhurried, letting the silence stretch long enough for them to hear their own doubt echo back. My lips curved in a small smile. You were too busy flaunting yourselves to notice when the ground shifted beneath your feet. The words landed with the certainty of stone, reverberating in the fragile quiet. For the first time, it was they who looked like intruders, not me. The chandeliers above seemed to mock their stunned faces, every crystal glinting like an accusation. Collins bent subtly toward me, his voice pitched so only I could hear. They're ready in the lounge, Miss Clare. And with that whisper, a deeper crack splintered through the glass facade of Harrington Power. The oldest servant in the house no longer served them. Collins straightened from his quiet lean beside me, shoulders squared, chin lifted with a dignity that silenced even the whisper of the candles. For decades he had been a fixture at Harrington Estate, a shadow gliding with trays of Bordeaux, the man who opened the doors before anyone thought to knock. He had been their constant, their invisible extension of power. Now, in the fragile stillness of the dining hall, he stepped forward, and with every step, the weight of his allegiance shifted audibly across the marble floor. He stopped at my side, folding his hands neatly in front of him, and his voice carried not the trembling deference of a servant, but the steady cadence of authority. From this day forward, he declared, my service belongs not to this family as a collective, but to Miss Clare Harrington. She is the rightful master of this house, and I answer to her alone. The air fractured. Maggie's shriek tore through the tension like glass breaking. You traitor! After everything we've given you? After everything you owe us, you side with her? Her face flushed a blotchy crimson, and the diamonds at her ears shook as she jabbed a finger toward him. John slammed both palms on the table so hard the crystal rattled, Bordeaux sloshing in its decanter. Enough of this nonsense, Collins. You'll remember who pays you, who clothed you, housed you, made you what you are. You don't get to decide where your loyalty lies. We are the Harringtons. You serve us. Collins turned his gaze toward him, calm and unflinching, his lined face illuminated by the soft glow of the chandeliers. He bowed not to John, not to Richard Sr., not to Eleanor's trembling posture, but to me. Loyalty, he said evenly, belongs where respect lives, and that, Mr. John, has never lived here. Gasps rippled down the table. Servants at the far edges froze, their eyes wide, their hands clutching empty trays like shields. Eleanor's pearls rattled against her collarbone as she whispered something inaudible. Maggie collapsed against the back of her chair, her indignation sputtering into silence. Even John, chest-heaving, faltered as if the ground itself had betrayed him. I sat unmoving, the flicker of candlelight dancing across the rim of my glass, watching the storm collapse into itself. Collins's words had done more than strip them of their butler, they had stripped them of their illusion. The very walls of the house seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting. And then, Richard Sr., who had remained stoic through the uproar, finally spoke. His tone was low, his words rolling out with the gravity of stone on stone. This violates everything our family stands for. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, pressing down on them all, and it was the first time the Harrington patriarch sounded less like a master and more like a man watching his empire crumble grain by grain. The louder they shouted, the more hollow they sounded. The grand dining hall, once filled with the performance of opulence, now echoed with desperate voices. The food had grown cold pheasant untouched, cranberry sauce congealing at the edges of silver bowls while the Harrington siblings thrashed against the shifting tide with words instead of reason. Maggie's face was blotched crimson, her jeweled hands trembling as she flung her accusation across the table. You must have married rich in secret. That's the only explanation. Some decrepit millionaire took pity on you. Admit it. Her voice cracked with hysteria, her usual poise unraveling strand by strand. John leaned in, his tone cutting, his posture sharp as though proximity would lend his claims weight. Don't listen to her games, he spat toward the others. She's bankrupt. This is smoke and mirrors, a rented card, forged documents, a pathetic trick. She wants to make us believe she's climbed above her station, but she's nothing. Always nothing. I let their frenzy wash over me, the words clattering against the high ceiling like coins tossed into a hollow jar. Calmness was my weapon, and I wielded it carefully. Eleanor, however, seemed caught in a vice. Her hand trembled around the stem of her glass, her pearls clicking nervously as she leaned forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Tell us the truth. Where did you get this money?" Their eyes clung to me, hungry for an explanation that might restore their hierarchy. I set my glass down with deliberate grace, the crystal kissing the mahogany softly, and allowed myself the faintest smile. "While you build glass castles," I said, my tone threaded with steel, "I build foundations." The word struck sharper than any accusation. Maggie recoiled as if slapped, her lips parting without sound. John bristled, his temper breaking through. He shoved his chair back violently, the legs screeching across the polished floor. His phone appeared in his hand like a weapon, his fingers flying across the screen. "Enough. I'll expose her. Right here, right now." The flickering candlelight reflected in his glasses as his thumb tapped furiously, pulling up news feeds, financial reports, anything that could prove his story. The table leaned with him, straining toward the device, as if salvation lay in the glow of the screen. And then, without warning, the headline appeared. "Breaking. Low Country Equity rumored to file record IPO." The words pulsed across the screen, bold and undeniable, a pronouncement louder than all their shouting combined. The air thickened with disbelief as John's jaw locked, his eyes refusing to leave the glowing truth in his hand. Maggie gasped audibly, her manicured fingers clawing at the tablecloth as if trying to rip it away. Eleanor froze, her lips trembling with the unspoken realization. I leaned back, watching them choke on the irony, the room itself colder than the untouched feast. They had shouted themselves hoarse, only to be silenced by the world outside these walls. The truth didn't come from me, it came from Wall Street. The glow of John's phone lit up the long dining table like a torch at the center of an ancient tribunal. Faces crowded toward it, eyes wide, breath shallow, each desperate to snatch a denial from the air, but finding none. John's hand trembled so violently that the screen wobbled in and out of focus, the candlelight shaking across his glasses. His voice cracked as he forced himself to read aloud. "Low Country Equity, preparing record, breaking IPO, valuation estimated at $20 billion. He swallowed, throat dry. "Majority ownership traced to Claire Harrington." The syllables dragged across the room like a chain. Maggie stumbled back into her chair as if the words had physically struck her. This can't be real," she whispered, her painted lips struggling to form the denial. Her knuckles whitened around her diamond bracelet, as though the shimmer could shield her from the truth gleaming from that little screen. Richard Sr. leaned forward at last, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing with something he had never directed at me before. Doubt turned inward. The mask of authority he had worn for decades, a mask carved from dominance and intimidation, began to fracture, lines of disbelief cutting through. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The silence pressed down, suffocating. I let it breathe just long enough. Then I broke it with the sharp clarity of a blade. "I told you," I said evenly, my voice threading through their collapse. "Independence isn't a disease, it's a weapon." The weight of my words fell heavier than the valuation number glowing on John's screen. For years they had called my independence a weakness, a liability, an exile from privilege. Now the world unbiased, merciless, had crowned it my strength. Eleanor's hand shook as she reached blindly for her wineglass. Her pearls tremored against her throat, her lips mouthing prayers that never reached air. And then the glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the polished floor, red wine spilling across the linen like blood spreading through a wound, the stain creeping, blooming, unstoppable. She gasped, the sound brittle, as if the ruin on the tablecloth mirrored the ruin inside her chest. The family sat frozen in the tableau, John clutching the phone as though he might crush it, Maggie trembling in disbelief, Richard Sr., carved in stone but hollowed at the core, Eleanor staring down at the crimson ruin. Only I remained still, hands folded, calm at the eye of the storm. And then, breaking the tension like a gavel's strike, came a sound. A knock at the great dining room doors, firm, deliberate, and startling in its intrusion. All heads turned. The doors opened with quiet ceremony, and Chef Laurent, the man who had once orchestrated their feasts like symphonies, stepped inside. His white coat was crisp, his demeanor composed, but when his gaze met mine, his chin dipped low. "Miss Clare," he said, bowing, his voice carrying the weight of years of silent observation, "your instructions are ready." The candle flames flickered as though bowing with him, and the Harringtons, for the first time, realized their empire was being dismantled, not by outsiders but by the very hands they thought belonged to them. Power wasn't the prize. Watching them see themselves was. The dining hall had grown darker, though the chandeliers still gleamed above. Shadows stretched across the opulent walls, pulling their faces into masks more grotesque than regal. The grand feast had gone untouched. The pheasant, once a centerpiece of pride, now lay limp and forgotten. Chef Laurent stood just behind my chair, his presence steady, his silence louder than any outburst. He had aligned himself with me without hesitation, and in doing so shifted the very axis of this house. I let the silence linger. It was my courtroom now, and they sat as defendants before me. My voice broke the air with deliberate calm, slicing through the weight, pressing down on them. "Do you want to know what I remember most?" I asked softly, my eyes sweeping the length of the table. "Not your money, not your threats, but the way you laughed." Maggie shifted uncomfortably, her hands trembling against her lap. I didn't let her speak. I pointed at her with nothing more than my gaze. "You mocked my home, called it a shoebox, my dress a costume from a thrift shop, and my career something you thought would wither without your charity." I turned toward John, who sat hunched forward, his bravado long drained. "And you?" I said. "Every deal you bragged about tonight, you ridiculed my independence as if it were a disease. You sneered at the very thing that gave me strength." His jaw twitched, but he couldn't look at me. He stared at the table instead, as if the polished mahogany might offer escape. Richard Sr. alone met my eyes, though the fire that once cowed boardrooms and terrified competitors had dimmed. His face was a fortress cracking, every line betraying what he had never admitted aloud: fear of losing control. I leaned back in my chair, hands folding as though I were the judge delivering the final word. "And while you mocked me," I continued, voice low but firm, "I built something you couldn't even fathom. You threw charity balls to be photographed. I built shelters no cameras ever saw. You bragged about excess. I invested in communities you pretended didn't exist." Maggie opened her mouth, desperate to regain footing, but Laurent stepped forward before she could spit another insult. His voice carried steady conviction. "Every chef in my network now answers to her. The Harringtons may pay invoices, but respect is something you've never earned, and respect is the only currency that lasts." Her mouth snapped shut. The silence was deafening. John sagged into his seat, shoulders collapsing inward. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, the arrogance drained until only fatigue remained. His phone, still lit with the headline of my triumph, slipped from his hand and landed on the linen without a sound. My breath came slow and measured as I spoke the words I had carried like a blade in my chest for years. "Wealth doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And tonight, you reveal everything." The verdict landed, not with shouts or defenses, but with resignation. I saw it in their faces, the realization that the empire they flaunted was nothing more than a mirror, reflecting the ugliness they'd buried under silk and silver. And then, breaking the heavy quiet, came the shrill ring of a phone. Not just any phone. Richard Sr.'s private line, the one he never ignored, the one only a handful of people even had. He fumbled to pull it from his pocket, his lips pale as the name lit up the screen. His private banker. Richard Sr. stared at it for one long second, then slowly raised his eyes to me. His voice cracked as he forced the words out. He wants to speak with you. The empire they bragged about was never theirs. It was already mine." The dining hall had gone still, as though even the air itself recoiled. The banker's voice echoed from Richard Sr.'s phone, cold and transactional, as if it were just another late-night deal. "Mr. Harrington, I'll need to speak directly with Miss Claire Harrington regarding the transfer agreements and pending securities." The words landed like gunshots, stripping away the last veil of family dominance. Maggie gasped first, her jeweled fingers clenching the edge of the table. "Transfer agreements? Securities? What does he mean?" Her eyes darted to Richard Sr., begging him to intervene, to restore the illusion that their control remained intact. But the banker continued, firm and unapologetic. "All notices, all authorizations our office recognizes Miss Harrington as the principal authority. We cannot proceed with any Harrington-related accounts without her." Richard Sr. stiffened, his jaw tightening until veins bulged along his temple. His thumb hesitated over the screen, as if cutting the call could erase the humiliation. But the damage had been done, the house had heard the verdict. I rose slowly, my navy dress brushing against the high-backed chair. Every eye followed me, trapped. "Shall we test the truth?" I asked quietly, almost kindly. "Maggie, do you remember that villa in Napa you bragged about? The vineyard you claim as proof of your superiority?" Maggie blinked rapidly, her lips twitching as if the right words might save her. "Of course it's mine, everyone knows." "No," I interrupted, savoring the silence that followed. "It was sold 4 months ago, not to a stranger, to me, through low country equity." The blood drained from her face so completely that she looked like porcelain about to shatter. Her bracelet jingled as her hands trembled uncontrollably, betraying the bravado she had once wielded like a whip. John leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table. "Lies," he spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "The Miami Tower deal, I closed it myself. No one could have taken that from me." I met his glare, unflinching. "Do you think banks don't report? Do you think your contracts vanish into the air?" My lips curved into a calm smile. "You might have signed the documents, John, but the holding company that owns your $80 million monument? That company is mine. Your tower belongs to me." His phone still lay on the table, its glass screen smeared with fingerprints. His hands hovered over it, useless, as though searching for a reality that no longer existed. Eleanor's voice trembled into the void. Then what is left?" She sounded more fragile than I had ever heard. The matriarchal veneer cracked. Her gaze darted to Richard Sr., but he no longer looked omnipotent. He looked small. Richard Sr.'s eyes narrowed, but not in disbelief calculation. I saw it in the way his brow furrowed, the way his breathing steadied. He understood, even if the others didn't. "This isn't coincidence," he growled. "This is a siege." I stepped closer to the table, every footfall echoing like a gavel strike. "While you paraded your millions, I bought your foundations," I said clearly, my voice cutting through their collapsing pride. "Every boast tonight? Already mine. Every jewel you flashed, every story you told it was all borrowed from me." Collins shifted in the corner, his presence like a shadow bearing witness. He didn't smile, but his eyes told me what I needed, confirmation that they understood this wasn't temporary. This was permanent. And then the storm broke. Richard Sr. slammed his palm against the polished wood so violently that the crystal glasses rattled and one toppled, spilling red wine in a dark stain across the white linen. His face, once the image of unshakable command, now burned with fury and dread. "What have you done with Harrington Capital itself?" he demanded, his voice thunderous, shaking the chandeliers above. The night wasn't about dinner anymore. It was an execution. The air in the Harrington dining hall had grown too thick to breathe, so I let Collins guide us into the adjoining lounge. It was a smaller, more intimate chamber paneled with mahogany, built for private negotiations and family decisions, the very room where Richard Sr. had once dictated my fate. Tonight, I would dictate his. The family followed in a staggered line, Maggie clutching her bracelet as if it could ward off the inevitable, John red-faced with rage, Eleanor pale and trembling, and Richard Sr. with his spine still rigid though his eyes betrayed cracks. John broke first. He stormed ahead of the others, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is fraud, a sham. She can't possibly hold what she claims she's lying, and I demand proof." His voice cracked on the last word, desperation seeping through the arrogance. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked to Collins, who nodded and opened the double doors. Michael Grant stepped inside, his leather briefcase gleaming in the candlelight. He was calm, polished, and as precise as the contracts he carried. His very presence shifted the room. The Harringtons knew his reputation as a ruthless corporate attorney. If he stood with me, then paper and law already had. Michael placed the briefcase on the table, unlatched it with deliberate slowness, and spread the documents across the polished wood. His voice carried the finality of a verdict. By acquisition dated the 12th of March, 2023, Miss Claire Harrington became controlling owner of Hamilton Bank. As custodian of the Harrington family trusts, Hamilton Bank now answers exclusively to her. The words detonated like explosives. Maggie staggered back, knocking into an armchair. No, that bank has held our family's wealth for generations, our accounts, our securities. It can't be hers. Her shrill protest was less denial than fear, a child insisting the ground beneath her wasn't shifting. John lunged forward, his hands slapping the table as though sheer force could dissolve the contracts. "Forgery! You've forged every page. I'll have the board investigate. I'll drag you into court myself. Michael didn't even flinch. Be my guest, he replied, tapping the embossed seals at the bottom of each contract. Every signature verified, every transfer approved. And your father's own legal team notarized the transition without realizing the buyer was Claire, masked through Low Country Equity subsidiaries. Eleanor's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her hands twisted the pearls at her throat until they nearly snapped. At last, a whisper escaped. Richard, tell me this isn't true. But Richard Sr. said nothing. His silence was the loudest sound in the room. I took a step forward, my heels striking the hardwood like a judge's gavel. Do you finally understand? I asked, scanning each of their stricken faces. This isn't about borrowed pride or empty titles. I didn't come here to beg or to prove myself. I came to reclaim what you stole from me the night you cast me out. John snarled, but his defiance was hollow. You think wealth makes you one of us? I leaned closer, my words slicing clean through the pretense. Wealth doesn't make me one of you. It makes you mine. The room quivered with their disbelief. Maggie collapsed into the nearest chair, her nails scraping the armrest as if to anchor herself. Eleanor's eyes glistened, wide with a sorrow that came too late. John clenched his fists, but there was no fight left, only the tantrum of a man already undone. Then I delivered the blade they had been dreading. Your trusts, your securities, your legacy, all answer to me now. The declaration hung in the air, heavier than the chandeliers above us. It was the final undoing, the truth too large for denial. And at last Richard Sr., who had sat in stone-faced silence while his empire collapsed, let the mask fall. His voice broke, raw and unrecognizable, as he whispered into the silence. You've outplayed me, your own father. Power doesn't scream when it wins. It watches the other side fall silent. The lounge had grown unbearably still, the kind of silence that follows a funeral service. The only sound was the slow tick of the antique clock on the mantel, its hands dragging the Harringtons further into the realization of their own undoing. The documents lay on the table like headstones, each page a reminder that what they once called eternal was already buried. Maggie broke first, her voice sharp and desperate, but the edge dulled by pleading. She rose halfway from her chair, wringing her diamond-clad hands. Claire, maybe we've been too hard on you, but we can make this work. Partner with us. Imagine what we could do together, you, me, the family, all united again. Her words quivered with rehearsed charm, but behind the gloss there was only panic. John didn't even look at her. He sat hunched at the far end of the table, shoulders slumped, eyes bloodshot. The arrogant smirk that once defined him was gone. He spoke in a rasp, as though confessing to himself more than anyone else. All those years, wasted bragging. I thought I was untouchable. He let out a hollow laugh that collapsed into silence, the sound of a man watching his identity disintegrate. Eleanor clasped her pearls with trembling fingers, her chin shaking as she turned toward me. Claire, dear. The word dear sounded foreign, like a script she no longer believed. Is there room for forgiveness in all of this? Her eyes pleaded with me, but they were the eyes of a woman who had turned blind to cruelty for decades, and only now sought absolution when the cruelty was no longer useful. Richard Sr. sat motionless until now. Slowly, with the weight of years pressing on him, he lowered his head. The proud Harrington patriarch, the man who had once looked down on me with the certainty of a king, finally looked smaller than the chair he occupied. His silence was no longer defiance, it was concession. For the first time, respect replaced arrogance in his eyes. I leaned forward, my words sharp enough to cut through their last illusions. You called me nothing. Tonight, nothing became everything. The truth of it reverberated in the chamber. They had mocked, dismissed, and discarded me, but in their laughter they had given me the resolve to turn exile into empire. Michael Grant quietly slid a leather-bound portfolio toward me. I placed my hand on it, savoring the weight of inevitability, and pushed it across the polished table toward them. The shuffle of paper was louder than any outburst could have been. I straightened, looking each of them in the eye. Sign, and we move forward. Refuse, and you lose everything. The sentence hung heavy, a guillotine suspended over their futures. I didn't want revenge. I wanted a lesson carved so deep it couldn't be forgotten. The study smelled faintly of oak and wax, the fire in the hearth reduced to a glow that flickered across the leather spines of unread books. The portfolio I had laid before them now rested under the dim halo of candlelight, the shadows elongating their faces until they looked more like specters than people of stature. Each of them hesitated, as if the ink on the pages could burn their hands. Michael Grant opened the folder with deliberate care, his voice steady, almost ceremonial. This is the founding charter of the Claire Harrington Foundation, dedicated to education initiatives, community health care, and the rebuilding of neglected neighborhoods across the Low Country. He let the words fill the room, a stark counterpoint to their endless years of indulgence. Maggie was the first to snap. She pushed back from the table, the scrape of her chair harsh against the silence. You can't be serious. Charity, hospitals, schools, that's not Harrington business. Her voice was shrill, stripped of its earlier confidence. You expect us to work? John slammed his palm against the armrest, his temper boiling over the quiet humiliation. This is extortion dressed up as philanthropy. You've stolen everything, Claire, and now you want us to grovel in soup kitchens to keep what little's left. His laughter was bitter, hollow. I'd rather burn it all than play servant to your foundation. I let them rage, their words only sharpening the moment. When they were spent, I leaned forward, my tone precise. The condition is simple. You will serve actively board meetings, site visits, personal accountability. If you want to keep your inheritance, you will contribute to something larger than yourselves. Not in name, in sweat. Richard Sr. raised a hand, silencing John with a glance that carried the old weight of command, though dulled now by resignation. Enough, he said, his voice low. His eyes met mine, no longer burning with disdain, but shadowed by something heavier understanding, perhaps even regret. For a long while, Eleanor stared at the document in front of her, her thin fingers trembling above the pen. Her lips moved as though in prayer, though no words emerged. Finally, she bent forward, tears slipping free as the nib touched the page. The scratching of her signature sounded like thunder in the hollow quiet. Maggie's mouth fell open in shock, betrayal slicing through her vanity. "Mother, how could you?" she hissed. Eleanor sat back, her voice barely a whisper. "Because she's right. We've built nothing but walls around ourselves." The room shifted. Even John faltered, his rebellion cracking beneath the sight of his mother's surrender. I stood, letting the gravity of the moment settle. "You will finally work for something greater than yourselves." The words were not a threat. They were a verdict. The candlelight wavered as Maggie slumped back in her chair, her voice stripped of fight. She whispered into the heavy air, her despair echoing like a confession. "Have we lost everything?" The loudest revenge is walking away with silence. The vast entrance hall of the Harrington estate echoed faintly with every step I took. The chandeliers above, once symbols of their grandeur, now felt like hollow ornaments swinging above a house that no longer belonged to them. The family lingered behind me in the study, but the silence they carried spilled outward, following me into this hall like a shadow that had lost its voice. I paused in front of the doors, the old oak polished to a gleam, and turned back one final time. My voice was steady, neither raised nor softened. The Harrington family dinners are no more. From now on, we meet once a month for the foundation board meetings. That is where legacy will be measured by service, not by excess. No one replied. John's jaw hung slack. Eleanor clutched her pearls as though they could anchor her. Maggie stared at the floor, and Richard Sr. sat motionless, his empire dismantled by his own neglect. Their silence was the truest applause I could have asked for. Collins appeared beside me, ever composed, his presence carrying more dignity than any of them had managed all evening. He held my coat with quiet reverence, placing it gently over my shoulders. "The car is ready, Miss Claire," he said, his tone carrying loyalty that no signature could command. As the heavy doors opened, a crisp wind rushed in, carrying the first flakes of snow. The estate's stone steps glistened faintly, the night painted silver beneath the headlights waiting at the drive. I stepped out, my heels echoing with the rhythm of finality. My phone buzzed in my hand. I answered without breaking stride. A calm voice on the other end confirmed what I already knew. The international deal had closed another expansion, another victory secured. I listened, nodded once, and ended the call. Business would continue. The Harringtons were just one chapter. I paused at the bottom of the steps, turning back briefly toward the house that had once been a prison. My words slipped into the frosted night, meant more for myself than for them. True power doesn't need an audience, but sometimes it deserves one. Snowflakes settled against my coat as I moved forward, Collins guiding me toward the waiting car. The headlights carved two bright lines into the darkness, a path cutting cleanly into whatever horizon lay ahead. I slid into the leather seat, the door closing softly behind me. With one last glance at the estate shrinking in the rearview mirror, I let the silence speak louder than anything I could have said. The engine purred, the car rolled forward, and the night swallowed the house whole. I stepped into the waiting car, headlights cutting into the night. Beneath the quiet snow that blanketed the Harrington estate, the echoes of arrogance and betrayal finally fell silent. What began as mockery and humiliation ended with a reversal, so complete it stripped power from the guilty and placed it in steadier hands. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime, reminding us that justice may arrive late, but it always arrives. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Type 1 if you felt the justice, or 2 if you believe it could have gone further.